The history of marriage and control in America. Colonial beginnings. Property and patriarchy. Introduction. The institution of marriage in colonial America was fundamentally shaped by the imperatives of property, social stability, and patriarchal control. Far from being rooted in romance or personal fulfillment, marriage was a legal and economic arrangement, deeply embedded in the structures of English common law and the doctrine of coverture. This system not only defined the rights and roles of husbands and wives, but also reinforced a social order in which control, especially over women and property, was paramount. This comprehensive overview explores the legal, economic, social, and cultural dimensions of marriage in colonial America, drawing on primary sources, legal texts, and historical analysis. 1. Legal foundations, English common law and the doctrine of coverture. 1.1. Importation of English law. The legal framework governing marriage in colonial America was directly imported from English common law. This system, developed over centuries in England, was adopted by the American colonies and adapted to local conditions. The most influential articulation of these principles came from William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, 1765 to 1769, which became the standard legal reference in both England and the colonies. 1.2. Marriage as a civil contract. Under English common law, marriage was fundamentally viewed as a civil contract. Blackstone wrote, "Our law considers marriage in no other light than as a civil contract. The holiness of the matrimonial state is left entirely to the ecclesiastical law. In this civil light, the law treats it as it does all other contracts, allowing it to be good and valid in all cases, where the parties at the time of making it were, in the first place, willing to contract, secondly, able to contract, and lastly, actually did contract, in the proper forms and solemnities required by law." This meant that marriage required mutual consent of both parties, legal capacity, age, mental soundness, not already married, observance of formalities, such as bans or licenses. 1.3. The doctrine of coverture. The doctrine of coverture was the cornerstone of marital law. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was suspended and absorbed into that of her husband. Blackstone famously stated, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband." Legal consequences for married women included loss of legal identity. Married women, femmes covert, could not own property, enter contracts, or sue and be sued independently. All property and earnings became the husband's debts and legal actions. The husband was responsible for his wife's debts incurred before marriage, and any legal action involving the wife had to include the husband as a party. Criminal law. In criminal cases, a wife could be prosecuted separately, but generally, neither spouse could testify for or against the other due to their legal unity. Limited exceptions. Only in rare cases, such as the husband's legal absence, could a wife act independently. Economic aspects. Marriage as a property arrangement. 2.1. Marriage as a business contract. Marriage in colonial America was often viewed as a business transaction between families. The primary concerns were the consolidation of property, wealth, and social status. Parents, especially fathers, played a central role in arranging marriages to ensure advantageous economic alliances. In colonial America, the process of courting and ultimately marriage was somewhat complex and didn't always come down to love. In some respects, marriage was more of a business contract among families than a relationship based solely on love. To parents, love was less critical than what could be gained or what they could afford. 2.2. Property, inheritance, and family wealth. Control of property. A young woman was under her father's control until marriage, at which point guardianship and control of her property passed to her husband. Inheritance practices. Traditionally, the eldest son inherited the bulk of the family estate, primogeniture, but by the 18th century, there was a shift toward more equal division among sons, allowing greater freedom in marriage choices, marriage settlements, and dowries. Legal agreements could specify the transfer of property, land, or money to the new couple, often as a dowry from the bride's family. These settlements were crucial in elite families but less common among the lower classes. 2.3. Bastardy laws and legitimacy: children born out of wedlock were considered illegitimate and had no right to inherit property. Bastardy laws ensured that only children born within a legal marriage could inherit, further emphasizing the economic importance of marriage. 3. Social and cultural expectations. 3.1. Patriarchal authority and gender roles. Colonial society was deeply patriarchal. Husbands were the heads of households, wielding legal, economic, and social power. Wives were expected to be obedient, manage the household, and bear children, reputation, and respectability. For women, reputation was crucial. Unmarried women past a certain age risked being labeled old maids, and their social standing could suffer. Social order. Marriage was seen as essential for the stability and success of the colonies, forming the foundation for family formation, economic productivity, and the transmission of property and values. 3.2. Marriage and community oversight. Marriage was a public contract with significant social implications. Parental involvement was especially pronounced, as the choice of a spouse could affect the family's social standing, economic prospects, and reputation. Parental consent. Laws in some colonies required parental consent for marriage, and in certain cases, even for courtship community oversight. In some religious communities, such as the Quakers, the entire community had to consent to a marriage. 3.3. The role of love and companionship. While economic and social considerations dominated, the idea of romantic love gradually gained importance over the colonial period, especially by the late 18th century. However, practical concerns almost always outweighed romantic ones. 4. Regional variations in marriage practices. 4.1. New England colonies. Puritan influence. Marriage was a civil contract regulated by the state, not the church. Judicial divorce was permitted in certain cases. Community oversight. Courtship and marriage were closely monitored by families and the community. 4.2. Middle colonies. Diversity. Ethnic and religious diversity led to a variety of marriage customs, including different courtship rituals and legal requirements. Quaker influence emphasized equality in marriage and allowed women a greater voice in marital decisions. 4.3. Southern colonies. Hierarchical structure. Marriage was often used to consolidate wealth and land among elite families. Gender imbalance. A significant gender imbalance led to a marriage squeeze, with many men remaining unmarried due to the scarcity of women. 4.4. Frontier and borderlands. Intercultural marriages. Marriages between European settlers and indigenous peoples were more common in early periods, but became increasingly stigmatized and legally restricted. 5. Divorce, practices and limitations. 5.1. English legal foundations. Divorce was extremely difficult under English law, with only annulments and legal separations permitted by ecclesiastical courts. Absolute divorce, allowing remarriage, was almost impossible, except through a private act of Parliament. 5.2. Colonial adaptations. New England developed a more permissive approach, viewing marriage as a civil contract. Judicial divorce was allowed on grounds such as adultery, cruelty, and desertion. Southern colonies followed the restrictive English model, requiring legislative action for divorce and limiting grounds primarily to adultery, and only for husbands, or compounded by cruelty or bigamy, for wives. 5.3. Limitations and social stigma. Divorce remained rare and heavily stigmatized. Women faced significant barriers due to coverture, and even when divorce was granted, women rarely retained custody of children or property. 6. Lived experiences. Women in colonial marriages. 6.1. Primary sources. Women's lived experiences are documented in letters, diaries, legal documents, and court records. These sources reveal the daily realities, challenges, and limited agency of women within marriage letters and diaries. Offer personal reflections on marriage, family, and household management. Legal documents show women's struggles for property rights, custody, and legal redress. Newspapers reported on marital disputes, runaway wives, and community responses. 6.2. Diversity of experience. The experiences of marriage varied by class, race, and region. While elite women might have some protection through marriage settlements, most women, especially those of lower classes, African American or indigenous backgrounds, faced even greater legal and economic vulnerability. The enduring legacy of patriarchy and control. The legal and cultural framework of marriage in colonial America established a system in which control rested firmly with men. Marriage was less a partnership than a merger, with the law and culture reinforcing patriarchal authority. The doctrine of coverture, as articulated by Blackstone, justified the subordination of women as natural and beneficial, shaping the lived experiences of women in the colonies and beyond. Conclusion marriage in colonial America was an institution designed to secure property, maintain social order, and reinforce patriarchal control. The legal doctrine of coverture, imported from English common law and codified by Blackstone, stripped married women of independent legal identity and property rights. Economic considerations dominated marriage arrangements, with families negotiating alliances to consolidate wealth and status. Social and cultural expectations reinforced the authority of husbands and the dependency of wives, while regional variations reflected the diversity of colonial society. Divorce was rare and difficult, especially for women, and the lived experiences of marriage were shaped by class, race, and region. The legacy of these colonial beginnings would continue to influence American marriage law and gender relations for centuries. The history of marriage and control in America, 19th century, reform and resistance. The 19th century in America was a period of profound transformation in the institution of marriage, marked by both significant reforms and persistent resistance. While the old patriarchal order, rooted in the doctrine of coverture and the subordination of women, began to crack, change was slow and uneven. This era saw the rise of industrialization, the emergence of the women's rights movement, the passage of Married Women's Property Acts, and ongoing struggles over divorce and social norms. Below is a comprehensive overview of these developments. 1. Industrialization and shifting gender roles. Economic change and women's work. The onset of industrialization in the early 1800s fundamentally altered the American economy and family structure. As men increasingly worked outside the home for wages, women's traditional roles as producers within the household diminished. The rise of factories, especially in the textile industry, created new opportunities for women to earn wages outside the home. The Lowell Mill girls in Massachusetts, for example, were young single women who left rural areas to work in textile mills, seeking economic independence and new social experiences, economic independence. For the first time, significant numbers of women could earn their own wages, which provided a measure of autonomy and delayed marriage for some. Double burden. Despite these opportunities, most women, especially those who married, continued to shoulder the double burden of paid work and unpaid domestic labor cult of domesticity. The dominant ideology of the cult of domesticity reinforced the notion that a woman's proper place was in the home, as a moral guardian and caretaker, even as economic realities often required women to work. 2. The women's rights movement and the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. The women's rights movement gained national attention with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. The convention produced the Declaration of Sentiments, which explicitly condemned the legal and social subordination of women, particularly within marriage as civil death. Stanton and her allies described marriage under existing laws as a form of civil death for women, echoing the reality that a married woman lost her legal identity, property rights, and autonomy. Key grievances. The Declaration of Sentiments listed grievances such as the denial of the right to vote, own property, earn wages, and obtain a divorce without losing custody of children. Stanton argued that marriage laws gave men absolute tyranny over women. Divorce reform. Stanton was a vocal advocate for making divorce more accessible, arguing that women should not be trapped in abusive or unhappy marriages. She also called for women to retain property and custody rights after divorce, demands that were considered radical even within the movement. 3. Legal reforms, Married Women's Property Acts. The doctrine of coverture and its challenge. Under the doctrine of coverture, A married woman's legal identity was subsumed under her husband's. She could not own property, enter contracts, or control her own earnings. This left women economically dependent and vulnerable. The First Property Acts, Mississippi, 1839. The first Married Women's Property Act in the U.S. was passed in Mississippi, allowing married women to own property in their own names, particularly property they brought into the marriage or inherited, and protecting it from their husband's debts. New York, 1848. New York, S. Married Women, S. Property Act, became a model for other states, declaring that all property owned by a woman at marriage or acquired by gift or inheritance would remain her separate property and not be subject to her husband's control or debts. Spread and limitations. Gradual adoption. By 1900, every state had enacted some form of Married Women's Property Act, but the scope and effectiveness of these laws varied widely. Regional differences. Southern states often focused on protecting family wealth from creditors, while Western states, influenced by Spanish civil law, recognized community property. Judicial interpretation. Courts often interpreted these laws narrowly, and many only protected property acquired before marriage, not property earned during marriage. Racial and class disparities. The benefits of these laws were not equally distributed. White property-owning women benefited most, while Black and Native women faced additional barriers. 4. Divorce laws. Restriction and gendered application. Restrictive and gendered divorce laws. Divorce laws in the 19th century remained highly restrictive and deeply gendered. Difficulty of divorce. In both England and the U.S., divorce was difficult to obtain. In England, a full divorce required a private act of Parliament until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, which still imposed unequal standards. A man could divorce for adultery alone, but a woman had to prove adultery plus another offense. U.S. state laws. American states varied, but most required women to meet a higher burden of proof than men. Grounds for divorce were limited, and women who left their husbands risked losing all property and custody of children. Social stigma and consequences. Stigma. Divorced women faced significant social stigma, often being ostracized or viewed as having failed in their primary social duty, custody, and property. The law overwhelmingly favored men in matters of property and child custody, leaving women economically and socially vulnerable. Resistance to reform. Efforts to reform divorce laws met with strong resistance from religious, political, and social institutions, which argued that easier divorce would undermine the family and social order. 5. Social attitudes and resistance. The ideology of separate spheres. The dominant ideology of separate spheres dictated that men belonged in the public world of work and politics, while women were relegated to the private domestic sphere. Women were expected to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. Stigma against independent women. Single women. Women who remained single or sought independence from marriage were often mocked as old maids or cat ladies, and seen as incomplete or deviant. Divorced women. Women who left their husbands faced far greater social punishment than men who abandoned their wives, including ostracism and loss of economic support. Resistance from institutions. Religious, political, and social institutions worked in concert to maintain traditional gender roles and suppress efforts toward equality, often using moral and practical arguments to justify their positions. Early resistance and changing attitudes. Despite these pressures, some women began to challenge the status quo, finding support in reform organizations and the emerging women's rights movement. Literary works and personal accounts began to explore the lives of independent women, contributing to a growing public debate about women's roles. 6. Lived experiences. Women's voices and primary accounts. Diaries, letters, and memoirs. Primary sources such as diaries, letters, and memoirs provide invaluable insight into how women navigated marriage, family, and the quest for autonomy, economic dependence, and legal constraints. Many women wrote about the frustrations of economic dependence and the legal constraints of marriage. Resistance and agency. Some accounts reveal acts of resistance, such as seeking work, pursuing education, or advocating for reform. Diversity of experience. While many sources reflect the experiences of white, middle-class women, There are also accounts from lower-class women, women of color, and immigrants, though these are less common. Conclusion: reform and resistance. The 19th century was a time of both reform and resistance in the history of marriage and control in America. Industrialization and the women's rights movement began to challenge the old order, leading to important legal reforms such as the Married Women's Property Acts. However, control was slow to loosen. Divorce laws remained restrictive and gendered, and society continued to punish women who sought independence from marriage far more harshly than men. The ideology of separate spheres, reinforced by religious, political, and social institutions, maintained the subordination of women within marriage and the family. Yet, through activism, personal agency, and gradual legal change, women laid the groundwork for the further advances of the 20th century. Introduction. The 20th century was a time of immense social, cultural, and legal upheaval in the United States, especially around the institution of marriage. Freedom and conformity constantly battled for dominance. As new liberties emerged, so did powerful forces seeking to restore old norms. Let's explore how these tensions played out across key decades. Early 1900s, respectability and social pressure. Marriage as social status. At the century's start, marriage remained deeply entwined with respectability. Single women were often seen as failures or oddities, spinsters or old maids. For both men and women, to be unmarried was to be socially suspect. Legal and economic dependence. Even with limited reforms, wives' legal and economic status was still subordinate to husbands. Most jobs were closed to married women. The expectation was that they would leave the workforce upon marriage. 1920s, votes for women, but not equality at home. The 19th Amendment, 1920. Women won the right to vote, a landmark in gender equality. Yet, within marriage, most women remained legally and culturally secondary to husbands. Social double standard, flapper culture, jazz, and new freedoms changed youth culture. But for married women, expectations of domesticity and subordination lingered. Post-war, suburban conformity and gender roles returned to rigid roles. After World War II, millions of women who'd worked in wartime industries were pressured to return home. The suburban dream took hold. Husband as breadwinner, wife as homemaker, and mother. Control as normalcy. Marital roles were idealized by media, advertising, and government policy. Dissent or deviation, such as divorce, nonconformity in gender expression, or even childlessness, was stigmatized. Legal discrimination persisted, with women often needing a husband's permission for credit or legal contracts. 1960s, the sexual revolution and questioning marriage, challenging. Old norms, the sexual revolution questioned the very foundations of marriage. Was monogamy necessary? Did marriage have to be permanent? Birth control pills, 1960, gave women new reproductive freedom, challenging the link between sex, marriage, and motherhood. Counterculture movements, hippies, feminists, gay rights advocates, openly critiqued traditional marriage. 1970s, no-fault divorce and new freedoms. No-fault divorce laws. California legalized no-fault divorce in 1969. The idea quickly spread. Now, couples could end a marriage without showing fault, like adultery or abuse. Greater freedom. Divorce rates climbed as leaving an unhappy marriage became less stigmatized and more accessible. Anxieties about the family. Some celebrated newfound autonomy, others worried about family breakdown. Debates about the effects of divorce, single parenthood, and changing gender roles consumed public discourse. Women's liberation movement pushed for further reforms. Equal pay, reproductive rights, protections from domestic violence. Conclusion. The 20th century's history of marriage in America is a story of competing forces, the drive for autonomy, self-fulfillment, and equality, constantly pushing against pressure to conform and maintain traditional roles. Every advance in freedom brought new debates, anxieties, and, ultimately, an evolving definition of what marriage could mean. Introduction. The late 20th century to the present has witnessed dramatic changes in the legal and cultural definition of marriage. While the most overt forms of control, such as coverture, which gave husbands legal authority over wives, are gone, new forms of choice and conflict have emerged. The story of marriage now centers on questions of equality, autonomy, and the continuing influence of tradition and politics. Legal milestones, expanding rights and recognition. Women's legal autonomy. By the end of the 20th century, women could own property, keep their wages, and initiate divorce, rights unimaginable in the colonial era. Interracial marriage. In 1967, Loving v. Virginia struck down laws banning interracial marriage, affirming marriage as a fundamental right, regardless of race. Same-sex marriage. In 2015, Obergefell v. Hodges made same-sex marriage legal nationwide, further broadening the legal definition of marriage. New forms of control and dependency. Economic dependence. Financial inequality persists. Many people, especially women and those in marginalized communities, remain economically dependent on spouses. Barriers such as wage gaps, lack of affordable childcare, and unequal division of labor at home continue to limit true autonomy. Social pressures. Marriage remains a marker of social respectability. Unmarried adults, particularly women, may still face stigma or feel seen as incomplete by family, media, and culture. Singlehood and non-traditional families are more accepted than ever, but societal expectations remain powerful. The political battleground, marriage as a moral issue. Debates about marriage are often proxies for deeper political and cultural divides. Abortion debates frequently center on ideas about the traditional family. Questions of who counts as family, e.g., same-sex couples, cohabiting partners, chosen families, are hotly contested in courts and legislatures. Religious liberty versus equality. Some argue for exemptions from anti-discrimination laws on religious grounds, especially regarding same-sex marriage. Policy and family structure. Tax codes, health care, and immigration laws still favor married couples, especially those fitting the traditional mold. Public policy often lags behind changing social realities, creating friction between law and lived experience. Conclusion. Marriage in the 21st century is shaped by both unprecedented freedom and enduring conflict. On paper, equality reigns, but daily realities often tell a more complicated story. Control has shifted from legal codes to economic structures, social norms, and political debates. The definition and meaning of marriage continue to evolve, reflecting the ongoing struggle between personal freedom and collective expectations. Marriage as mirror, power, choice, and control in American history. Marriage in America has always been more than a private relationship. It is a social institution that reflects, reinforces, and sometimes challenges the prevailing power structures of its time. Across 4 centuries, the institution of marriage has served as a mirror for property, patriarchy, independence, conformity, freedom, and the ongoing tension between personal choice and cultural control. Below, we trace this evolution, drawing on historical and contemporary scholarship to address the enduring question: is marriage a bond freely chosen, or a structure built to keep people in line? Colonial America. Marriage as property and patriarchy. In colonial America, marriage was fundamentally an institution of control, deeply rooted in English common law and patriarchal norms. She could not own property, enter contracts, or control her own wages. All assets and income became her husband's upon marriage, patriarchal authority. Men were the undisputed heads of households, wielding authority over wives, children, and property. Marriage laws reinforced male dominance and structured the distribution of wealth and power. Economic function. Marriage was an economic contract as much as a personal relationship, ensuring the orderly transfer of property and the subordination of women, limited exceptions. While some legal mechanisms, like separate estate trusts, allowed a few elite women to retain property, these were rare and did not challenge the overall patriarchal structure. In this era, marriage was less a matter of personal choice and more a mechanism for maintaining social order and property relations. The 1800s, marriage and the fight for women's independence. The 19th century saw the rise of the women's rights movement, which directly challenged the legal and social subordination of women within marriage. Coverture challenged. Activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony targeted the injustices of coverture, demanding property rights, contractual capacity, and personal autonomy for married women's property acts. Beginning in 1839, states passed laws granting married women the right to own property and control their earnings. By 1900, every state had enacted some form of these laws, marking a significant shift in the legal status of married women. Suffrage and broader equality. The campaign for women's suffrage was closely linked to the fight against marital subordination, culminating in the 19th Amendment in 1920. Marriage in this period became a battleground for independence and equality, as women fought to transform it from a structure of control to one of partnership and mutual respect. The 20th century. Conformity, individual freedom, and the paradox of choice. The 20th century was marked by a dynamic tension between social conformity and individual freedom within marriage. Early 20th century. Marriage remained a near universal expectation, with strong social and religious pressures to conform to traditional gender roles and family structures. Mid-20th century. The rise of companionate marriage emphasized emotional intimacy and personal fulfillment. But these ideals often coexisted with persistent expectations of conformity. Feminism and legal reform. The women's rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s led to further legal reforms, including easier access to divorce, property rights, and greater gender equality within marriage no-fault divorce. The introduction of no-fault divorce laws in the late 1960s and 1970s allowed couples to end marriages without proving wrongdoing, reflecting a shift toward personal autonomy. Despite these advances, marriage continued to serve as a mechanism of social regulation, shaping norms around sexuality, gender, and family life. The wedding paradox emerged. Individuals sought to personalize their marriages, yet often conformed to traditional rituals and societal expectations. Late 20th century to present. Choice, conflict, and cultural control. In recent decades, marriage has become increasingly individualized, yet it remains a site of cultural and political conflict. Legal milestones. The legalization of interracial marriage, Loving v. Virginia, 1967, and same-sex marriage, Obergefell v. Hodges, 2015, expanded the definition of marriage and reflected broader struggles for equality. Declining marriage rates. Marriage rates have declined, with more people delaying or forgoing marriage altogether. This trend is driven by changing social norms, economic pressures, and the rise of cohabitation, economic dependence, and inequality. Despite legal equality, economic dependence still traps many, especially women and marginalized groups, in marriages they might otherwise leave. Wage gaps, lack of affordable childcare, and unequal division of labor persist. Social and cultural pressures. Marriage remains a marker of social respectability, and unmarried adults, particularly women, may still face stigma or be seen as incomplete political battleground. Marriage is often at the center of political debates over abortion, family structure, and LGBTQ+ rights. Laws and policies continue to privilege certain family forms, and cultural conflicts over the meaning of marriage remain intense. Today, marriage is both a symbol of personal choice and a structure shaped by economic, social, and political forces. The tension between autonomy and conformity, freedom and control, is as present as ever. Scholarly perspectives. Marriage as choice versus control. Scholars have long debated whether marriage is primarily an institution of choice or of control. Historical control. For much of history, marriage served to regulate property, inheritance, sexuality, and social order, often at the expense of individual autonomy, especially for women. Modern choice. In contemporary Western societies, marriage is increasingly framed as a matter of personal choice, love, and mutual support. Legal reforms and social movements have expanded the possibilities for individual autonomy within marriage. Persistent control. Yet marriage still functions as a mechanism of social control through legal incentives, cultural norms, and economic structures. Feminist and critical theorists argue that even today, Marriage can perpetuate inequalities and serve as a site of power struggles. The institution of marriage, then, is not static. It is a living mirror, reflecting the shifting balance between personal freedom and collective expectations, between the desire for connection and the imperatives of social order. Conclusion: the enduring question. Across American history, marriage has always been a mirror of power, reflecting and shaping the struggles over property, patriarchy, independence, conformity, and freedom. The same question lingers beneath every era. Is marriage a bond freely chosen, or a structure built to keep people in line? The answer is both. Marriage has been, and remains, a site where personal desires and social imperatives meet, sometimes in harmony, often in conflict. Its meaning and function continue to evolve, shaped by the ongoing negotiation between individual autonomy and the forces of tradition, law, and culture.